Case History 201.
Presentation 15, James Monroe and the Era of Good Feelings. This is the last presentation for the new material for Unit 3. We're finishing up with the last president of these first 5, all members of the founding generation. And historians often call this period the Era of Good Feelings, and I'm going to talk about that throughout the presentation, or at least touch on it a couple of times, and whether that's an accurate term or not, and of course what that means. So let's get started. All right, so James Monroe is the president during this period of time. He is the 5th president of the United States, served from 1817 to 1825. He's the last of the Virginia dynasty. Remember, 3 consecutive presidents from Virginia: Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. And the last of the founding generation to serve in the executive office. Now, he had a pretty good resume coming into the executive branch. He was a war hero during the American War for Independence. He was Secretary of State at one point, served in Congress, was instrumental as an opponent of the Constitution at one point. So he had a distinguished political career. Not many people thought he was an extremely intelligent guy, but he almost won his second term unanimously, so he had to be doing something right. Now, historians often call this the era of good feelings because there aren't any contending parties. Everyone called themselves Republican. Now, whether they were or not is another question. Remember, with the Hartford Convention in 1814, the Federalists very much discredited themselves. And so they stopped calling themselves Federalists in that 2-year period, 1815 to 1817. And they started saying they were Republicans. Now, the Federalists are still around. They just called themselves National Republicans, typically. And so that wing of the party is going to become very important a little bit later on, near the end of the Monroe administration. But whether this was an era of good feelings is up for debate. So here's his election in 1816. You can see he gets 84% of the Electoral College votes. It's a good majority. Now, just before he takes office, the Congress will pass something known as the Tariff of 1816. The tariff is a tax on imported goods, and we'll talk a lot about tariffs as we move forward. But the Tariff of 1816 was a slight protective measure designed to protect American manufacturers from imported goods. That's what a protective tariff does. So you pass a tax on imported goods designed to protect American manufacturers in those same industries from foreign competition. So Americans will buy American. This is payback to the North. Remember, the North was damaged by the Embargo Acts, by the legislation leading up to the War of 1812 with Great Britain. And so the idea was, in the spirit of union, well, we'll pass this tariff to help them out a little bit. So this is a tax on wool and cotton and iron manufacturers. Now, it wasn't a heavy protective measure. People could still buy these foreign goods if they wanted to. It wasn't punitive tariff in that way. But the idea was to get a little more commerce going in the North. But the important thing about this is that tariff legislation will become a major issue in American history as we move forward. We'll talk about it later. Now, one of the major issues during the Monroe administration early on is Florida. Andrew Jackson, who's still operating down in the Gulf of Mexico area, wrote to the Monroe administration claiming that he could control Florida within 60 days. And there was a problem here. There was something called the First Seminole War going on. The Seminole Indians had risen up against the United States. And they were being encouraged by the British. And, of course, Florida is a Spanish possession. So you have 3 distinct entities here working. You have Spanish territory, British government, and the Seminole Indian tribe. And Jackson doesn't get any word back from the Monroe administration that he could do this. So he just thinks, well, if there's no news is good news, so I'm going to invade Florida and take care of this problem. So he does. He actually marches into Florida, took St. Mark's in Pensacola, and in the process he's going to capture 2 British officials who he accused of inciting the Seminole Indian tribes, and he's going to execute them. Well, this creates an international problem. He's invaded a territory without authorization, a foreign territory. He's now executed 2 British officials without authorization, and you've got the Seminole Indian War as well. So the Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, and the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, want Jackson punished for this. But Jackson had secured East Florida for the United States, and so this opens the door for American control. So Monroe and the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, think, well, this is a good opportunity to work out a treaty with the Spanish to get Florida, and that's what they do. So Adams will work out something known as the Adams-Onease Treaty of 1819. Spain would cede Florida to the United States in return for American renouncement of claims to Texas and $5 million. So we pick up East Florida. So Jackson did what he said he was going to do. But, of course, because Clay and Calhoun were against him, this is going to come back later to work in that personal relationship Jackson has with Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. But more Calhoun in this case. Clay is something else. But Clay, Calhoun, and Jackson will all be mortal enemies at one point. So here's the Adams-Onease Treaty, and you can see, so we give up our claims to Texas and all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. and but we do get Florida, and we pay $5 million. Now, 1819 is also an important year because there's some financial problems. There's a panic, a depression. Many blame this panic on the Bank of the United States, which had just been rechartered, remember, following the War of 1812 during the Madison administration. Thomas Hart Benton in Missouri called the bank the Monster Bank. So did Andrew Jackson later on. And that's interesting because Thomas Hart Benton put a bullet in Andrew Jackson's shoulder during a duel, and Jackson had problems with that for quite some time in his life. What's going to happen here is that Maryland will tax the bank. The state of Maryland will tax the Bank of the United States, ostensibly to force it out of existence in that state. So they're trying to get rid of it. They're saying the bank is manipulating the financial sector and is causing problems, which it was. So this case is going to make it to the Supreme Court. McCulloch, who's the president of the Bank of Maryland, refuses to pay the tax. And so this becomes a legal issue. So when the case gets to the Supreme Court, it's known as McCulloch v. Maryland. And John Marshall, of course, is Chief Justice. And this is going to be one of the seminal cases in Supreme Court history. Marshall makes a statement, the power to tax is the power to destroy, which he's correct about that. But what this is going to do, this decision, is strengthen the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution. All Marshall is doing is channeling Alexander Hamilton, and the McCulloch's attorney was Daniel Webster, and Daniel Webster was channeling Alexander Hamilton. So essentially what you have is Marshall deciding based on a position Alexander Hamilton had taken when the bank was first chartered in 1791. It doesn't mean it's constitutional. But what Marshall does is say, well, we have the necessary proper clause, and so you can read between the lines, essentially, as long as the law is within the letter and spirit of the Constitution, it's constitutional. So these are called implied powers. This is a very important decision because what it does is codify this idea of loose construction, that the Constitution can be interpreted loosely. Now, that's not how the Constitution was argued or is going to be interpreted when it was ratified in 1787 and 1788. Marshall himself said it wasn't going to be interpreted that way, but now as Supreme Court Chief Justice, they're going to argue that position. Of course, Joseph Story was around, and Story will later write a important book on the Constitution in the 1830s. And so this decision is detrimental for the strict construction argument, because the strict construction argument would say that this is complete hogwash. But Marshall's codified now loose construction, and now you have a serious debate because the Supreme Court has come down on one side. And Marshall knew what he was doing when he did this. Now, again, he lied then in his previous positions, but in 1819 he didn't care. Now, a couple other important decisions during this Marshall Court and the Monroe administration. 1821, you had Cohens v. Virginia. The state of Virginia insisted that the Supreme Court could not invalidate state law, and state courts were not subject to federal oversight. And so they challenged the Judiciary Act of 1789. Marshall disagreed and wrote the Supreme Court could invalidate or overturn state law. So this is an important decision because now what he's saying is that the Supreme Court can rule on any case, right? It has jurisdiction over state law and federal law. Now, Marshall insisted in Virginia Ratifying Convention in 1788 that this was not going to be the case. So this is problematic. All the proponents of the Constitution said that the Supreme Court would not invalidate state law. The state courts remain intact. Now they're going back on that. So this becomes, again, Marshall's trying to push this nationalist agenda. We talked about this in the Jefferson presentation. And then you have Gibbons v. Ogden. This case is important because it broadens the Commerce Clause. Commerce does not stop at state lines, and therefore the general government could regulate anything that might be considered commerce. Also, commerce cannot interfere with purely interstate commerce. So anything produced just for sale in state, the government cannot regulate. Marshall said that. Now, of course, the government regulates that stuff now, but Marshall said you can't. But this very broad interpretation of the Commerce Clause expanded the powers of the general government. If they say it could be considered commerce, they can regulate it and tax it or whatever they want to do to it. So that's not what the idea was of the Commerce Clause. It was to keep commerce free and open between the states, not for some type of regulation or federal oversight. But this is essentially what Gibbons v. Ogden does. Now, this is also an important period of time because you have the growth of the sectional conflict. So I mentioned before, it's not the era of good feelings because North and South are going to start really being antagonistic here. They already had been, but
you see it here as well. So the United States was changing very rapidly. The population of the North was a little over 5 million. Population of the South a little under 5 million. So those numbers are not entirely accurate, though, because a good portion of the Southern population there were slaves, and so not all those people counted towards representation. So the South only had 81 votes in the U.S. House, while the North had 105. So really the only way for the South to maintain a balance in the Congress was through the Senate. So at this point there were 11 free states and 11 slave states, which meant each section had 22 senators. So the West and the admission of new states becomes very important. Think back to the Hartford Convention and the last presentation, and how the New Englanders wanted to prevent new states from being added. They wanted to remove the Three-Fifths Compromise of the Constitution. They're trying to knock down the power of the South. This is all about power and political economy. So when Missouri petitions to come into the United States or petitions for statehood, admission to the Union, I should say, there were attempts by Northerners to disallow Missouri's position of being a slave state. Of course, Missouri being a slave state would disrupt the balance of power. And so Northerners say, well, look, we'll give you Alabama, South, you give us Maine to keep this balance of power, but that wasn't the issue. Missouri was the issue. So either free territory is going to upset the balance of power in Congress, make the South a permanent minority, or the North fears that more southern states are going to make the North a permanent minority. So Old Federalists knew that the slavery issue was one way to damage the relationship between the South and the West, because the West was not necessarily pro-slavery in much of the Western territory, and they weren't receptive to it. So they think, okay, if we can use this, these Southerners are trying to expand slavery, not for moralistic reasons. These people weren't concerned about slaves morally. They didn't really want the labor competition. They didn't want blacks living in their state. So this was, in some cases, a racial disdain for a particular population in the United States. But they knew that if they could split this alliance with the West and the South, maybe they could peel off the West and forge an alliance with the North, and that would make them the permanent majority. The North thought that. The South was also thinking the same thing. So there's Missouri, and Missouri is going to try to come into the Union. What's going to happen is something called the Missouri Compromise. This was authored by Henry Clay. Missouri will be made into as a slave state, Maine as a free state. So each section gets one. Slavery will be prohibited, though, in the Louisiana Purchase above 3630, the southern border of Missouri. So if you go back here, slavery is allowed below this line, so this territory right here. Slavery is prohibited above that line, so all that territory. So you can see the North is going to get a lot more territory out of this. Now, the South believed that the North couldn't do this, the Congress couldn't do this, because slavery regulation in the territories is unconstitutional. This is the common property. You can't deny Southerners bringing their property into the common property of the United States. The North countered by stating that because they regulated the territories, they could regulate slavery in the territories. States were another matter, though. What's going to happen here, though, this compromise will maintain the balance of power in the Senate, 12 and 12. But it's really just setting the stage for even more problems later on. Now, James Monroe will be re-elected in 1820, really ran without opposition. He had one electoral college vote cast against him because that one elector thought that only George Washington should be elected unanimously. So Monroe didn't get unanimous election in 1820, but it's virtually unanimous. Now, two major issues in his second term, the American system, which I'll talk about, and foreign policy. So there's the 1820 election. Now, let's talk about this American system. Henry Clay of Kentucky is going to author something called the American system. This is really just the Hamiltonian economic system repackaged. Called for high protective tariffs, federally funded internal improvements, a central bank, stimulation of commerce and industry through federal means. And Clay is from Kentucky, which is considered a western state at this point. And what you're seeing here now is a growing alliance between the North and the West. And this becomes important as we move forward. So Westerners like the idea of this American system because they get the federally funded internal improvements. And so that's going to benefit them. The North likes this because, of course, they get the tariffs. They get the central banking system. They get the stimulation of commerce and industry. So this is something that Clay is willing to work out because, again, ultimately he thinks this is going to be the best thing for the United States as a whole. But more importantly, the North loves this because it's going to peel the West away from the South because the Southern political economy was different. Now, just to give you an example, Monroe was against this thing. He actually vetoed something called the Cumberland Road Bill of 1822. It would have built a road with federal dollars. And he said, you can't do this. It's a good idea, but we need a constitutional amendment. So that's never been settled in U.S. history. Federal government builds roads all the time. We don't have a constitutional amendment. Both Madison and Monroe said there needs to be a constitutional amendment to do this. And there has never been. So it's just like the Bank of the United States. That issue was settled just because it was signed into law, but and because the Supreme Court said that in McCulloch v. Maryland that the bank is constitutional. But it really hasn't been settled because in the Philadelphia Convention, the issue of a bank was broached in the convention, and everyone rejected it. So you have this lingering strain of resistance to these things because it never really was settled outside of some partisan politics getting involved and people saying, well, because we're in power, it's going to be settled. Now, last thing is the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. It's actually authored by John Quincy Adams, not by Monroe, but Adams, who was Secretary of State. But the Monroe Doctrine said a few things. Number one, the American continents were no longer subject to future colonization by Europe, and the U.S. considered colonization dangerous to its peace and security. So what's going on here in the 1820s is that Napoleon is out of power in Europe, and you have these conservative governments coming back into power in the rest of Europe, Austria and France, and so there's discussion of actually recolonizing parts of the Western Hemisphere. Well, the United States says that this isn't going to happen. Now, if there's already colonies here, fine, but you can't recolonize here in Latin America. And there's reasons for this. Number one, the United States said that the American political system was different from Europe. And so you just need to stay out of here. Look, in return, the United States is not going to get involved with existing colonies, or the United States is not going to interfere in European internal affairs, nor would the United States take part in European wars solely for foreign interests. So all they're doing here is essentially codifying George Washington's foreign policy from the first administration, a policy of neutrality. Now, the United States couldn't enforce this thing. Great Britain would have to. And so the United States is going to take a policy of neutrality in Europe and steer clear of European wars. That was the idea. We stay in our half of the world, you stay in your half of the world, and everybody will get along fine. Really, the doctrine was not noticed in Europe, but by the late 19th century, American presidents would use it incorrectly as a justification for American imperialism and control of the Western Hemisphere. That was the problem. The way that Teddy Roosevelt and others used the thing. All right, so was this the era of good feelings? Well, not really. I mean, there's sectional political economic conflict. Foreign policy is, we're just codifying Washington's foreign policy here. But you can see that the North and the South are not necessarily in agreement over the future of the government. Monroe, though, was the last of the founding generation to occupy the executive office. From this point forward, you're going to get new blood, which will forever change the government and change the executive branch. Some things are going to drastically change with the incoming administration. So we'll talk about that for Quiz 4 material, and I will see you next time.